We are talking about Gary Gensler again. The SEC is considering reopening a proposal from last year that would target DeFi platforms as exchanges that need to be regulated. So you'll remember in January 2022, the agency proposed expanding the definition of exchange to capture a broader swath of trading activity in the US. The industry responded to the agency again last year when this was first proposed, calling the initial proposal an overreaching power grab with not enough clarity. Surprise, surprise. We keep hearing that same description in response to almost everything the SEC does, but no real response from the agency. Danny, I'm going to kick this one off to you first. What do you think of the SEC's move to reopen this proposal?
Well, it's really not surprising, and you're already seeing some in the DeFi and decentralized exchange world taking active measures to avoid what they think is the inevitable outcome here, which is to say that the SEC brings the hammer down on DEXs in Solana land, which we'll talk about more in depth a little later. One DEX called Orca has actually pulled out from the U.S. market because probably regulatory concerns. And that's just a proactive step in advance of what is really likely to happen here, which is that the SEC will propose and push forward rules that will expand the definition of exchange in such a way that it will cover or purport to cover decentralized exchanges, these entities that aren't supposed to be coverable, according to them, of course.
Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that what we're looking at here is kind of a stomp the gecko moment, which is that it's sort of like that's a term from my old friend Andreas Antonopoulos, which basically says that to the extent that you take something that's relatively harmless and easy to understand and you make it impossible to be that thing, then you necessitate an evolutionary process that results in something that isn't vulnerable to that particular type of pressure before. I appreciate that's a lot of stuff to say, but basically what it means is that if you go after sort of the companies as they exist today, then all you're going to do is push the evolutionary track towards companies that can't be gone after in this way, largely because they won't be companies, right? DeFi has sort of leaned on the idea and leaned on many tools that have come from the world of decentralization. But a lot of the projects that are out there really are companies that have a DeFi product where they're operating, but it is a company. And so in that way, it does make sense for the SEC to have some jurisdiction here. But the broader concept is about DeFi. And it's also worth noting that that in this sort of update, they don't intend to actually define what DeFi is. They intend to keep that ambiguous, and that ambiguity really helps them to extend their power as kind of much as possible. So more to say on this, but where are you kind of on this, Jen?
Yeah, all of this ambiguity just makes me feel deflated when I read these stories about the SEC, if I'm being honest. There was a quote from Gary Gensler in the article. It said, "Calling yourself a DeFi platform is not an excuse to defy the securities law." It pointed to some industry comments that said the proposal would improperly apply regulations designed for intermediating exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange to software and software developers. And I think that's a really important piece here, right? When we're talking about software and software developers, there is a real differentiation to be made between this, the technology, and what's happening at exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange. And the more that the SEC is blind to this, and I paused before I said blind because I don't think they're blind. I think they're being very thoughtful about what they're doing, Adam, just like you were saying, because in the future, I think they're keeping the doors open for what could happen in the future. And it's really sad. It makes me think back to Hester Peirce's sandbox proposal. She really said, we need to give DeFi companies the space to actually decentralize. These companies are companies with ideas and products, but if we're not able to give them the space to decentralize and achieve these goals, we're just going to end up in the same place we are, not solving any of these real world issues that we're trying to solve. And that's kind of where I am. I think I saw your hand go up, Adam.
Yeah, I think, while these may deflate you, they honestly fire me up. These are kind of the types of moves that we see out of regulators that really don't have a better option, right? It's a sign of weakness to not go after creating real rules that clearly define and delineate what is and isn't okay, and that would apply to the types of technologies that we're talking about here. So the fact that they're not doing that, and the fact that they haven't been doing that for going on 10 years, and add to that the fact, of course, that the CFTC, the Commodities Future Trading Commission, another regulator that deals with commodities commodities rather than securities basically has a perspective that is 100% conflicting with the securities regulator. They both claim that most of the assets that exist within the world of crypto are, depending on who you ask, commodities or securities. And they can't both be true. And there's no move in Congress. There's no move at the legislative level. There's no move really anywhere to correct that conflict between two regulatory agencies that should matter a lot, but it doesn't matter because the point isn't to solve this problem. The point is to create problems, to create uncertainty, and to make it dangerous for good actors to exist in these spaces, in which then makes room for bad actors to come in and do what they're comfortable with, which is operating in spaces where the rules aren't defined because they don't care about the rules anyways. Danny, any thoughts?
Yeah, and what I'm really thinking about here is how the SEC will inevitably attempt to enforce these types of rules. I imagine that the SEC will start with the easiest targets, which is to say the companies that are companies. Not to say Uniswap's doing anything wrong here, but the Uniswap Labs, instead of the person who wrote the smart contract that Uniswap that you trade tokens through Uniswap on. Now they'll start with the Uniswap Labses of the world. Again, I'm not just using that as a point of reference, but ultimately the power in crypto comes from the smart contracts, those things that are said to be written by anyone and can be deployed by anyone. So I'm curious to see what the SEC, how far the SEC is willing to go to actually regulate the source of DeFi protocols and decentralized exchanges, because unless they're really willing to go after the writers of smart contracts, it's not going to be possible to stop people from doing anything other than just making it harder to get to an easy to use user interface.